Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our program today, we're pleased to have Megan McArdle, journalist and author, discussing her new book, The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. As a personal expert on failure, having spent 38 years in the tech business chasing all manner of dreams, I thought it'd be great to compare notes. Megan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Megan, your book was a fascinating amalgam of the redemptive power of failure in your own life and also analysis of how failure is handled or not in several different industries. Maybe we can start at the top with your view of what makes America different. And if you don't mind, I'd like to quote from your book. You state that we're the descendants of failure who fled to these shores from their creditors, their failed farms, their disastrous love affairs. If things didn't work out in New York, we picked up and moved to North Dakota. Somewhere along the way, we built the biggest, richest country in the world. Is failure really that big a part of the American experience?
Absolutely. I mean, it's in all of our stories, right? It's in the canonical stories of America. It's in, everything from Washington's despair at Valley Forge to Thomas Jefferson, who at the end of his life almost went bankrupt. And in fact, one thing that you see in the Constitution is that the government is empowered to create a bankruptcy code, which was really novel at the time, and because these guys often had terrible debts that they weren't sure they could pay. Go on to Mark Twain, who was a serial failure. He tried so many jobs, finally got into writing because the Mississippi steamboat trade had been shut down. He was famously a steamboat pilot, and then he tried his hand at all sorts of things, including mining. And when that finally all played out, he
tried the newspaper business.
Yeah.
And in fact, if it weren't for his failed investments in the typesetting business, we never would have gotten his wonderful lecture tour.
Yes, indeed. He wanted to be a businessman. It was a time when people really admired businessmen. He wanted to get rich. And so he went into the publishing business, and he actually did okay in the publishing business, but he did really, really badly at an attempt to invent a typesetting machine. And so when that went under, it took the whole publishing house and all of his personal finances with it.
And in fact, it was his lecture tour and his Ulysses S. Grant biography that actually brought him back at the very end,
yes.
I think.
The Ulysses S. Grant biography is, Grant himself.
Right.
It's a great story of failure. The general who he replaced at the head of the Union troops had been the fair-haired boy of West Point, top of his class. Everyone was really excited when he took over because he was the finest officer they had. And then he sat in Washington and he wouldn't go out and fight.
He did a lot of marching.
Demanding more troops.
Yeah, so we put a drunk in there, and he somehow did great. So you've convinced us now that we've all got failure in our DNA. Why has that led to greatness?
Well, in part because freedom can be just another word for nothing left to lose, right? When you don't have anything, I'm not saying it's all, beer and Skittles. However, it does open up the path because you have so little to lose. You can try things that other people might not dare. But the other thing is that it's not just enough to take risks or to let things fail. It's good that we don't bail out big industrial concerns that go under, usually.
Well, we used to not,
But it's just as important what happens after people failed. Are they resilient? Do they pick themselves up and try again? And does the system that they're in, the family, the corporation, the government, encourage them to do that, to move on from what wasn't working and start over with some new thing that has a better shot at working out?
Well, I guess we're also the land of the second chance, and that's what makes a big difference.
We really are, and it's surprising how much this comes through when you talk to European executives versus American executives, especially in Silicon Valley, where having failed is really viewed as a resume enhancer. And people will say, well, it's great. You learned a lot on someone else's dime, and now I want to take that knowledge and put it to work. Whereas in a lot of other countries, it's really intensely shameful and something that probably going to make it hard for you to get another good job. And that's a phenomenal waste of human resources, right? We all know that we learn more by failing than succeeding often.
It tempers the risk-reward culture. I know we won't invest in France. And when we invest here in the United States, I always get entrepreneurs to tell me their failure stories because you learn more about their character in how they failed. Did they fail well? Did they do their best? Did they meet their commitments? Did they internalize their failure, or did they blame it on others? And that seems to make a big difference. Absolutely.
It's a fine line because on the one hand, you really have to understand failure is part of the same process as success. Someone having failed does not mean that they're unworthy or an idiot or something, but often they did play a role in it. And the important thing is, do they understand what that role was? Are they now taking that information and going forward and correcting for that? Those are the people who are going to have the most chance of turning an early failure into a later success.
Well, and because you have two different kinds of answers. One is my CFO stole from me, that's why I failed. The other was I hired the wrong CFO. And those are very different answers to that question.
Exactly. And you really need to understand that, okay, your CEO shouldn't have stolen from you, but also, were there warning signs, both before you hired him, but also afterwards? Could you have seen this coming had you been paying more attention? And so I talked to one entrepreneur, interestingly, says he only hires people who've worked for failed companies because they've developed a kind of spidey sense. And when they see something that's happening that looks like what happened at the last firm, the alarm bells go off and they say, wait a minute, let's not do this. Let's do this other thing that we realized in retrospect would have been better. But of course, you need people who've actually developed that spidey sense, not just by being there, but being determined to learn from what they saw when they were in that situation.
High tech really seems to win the crown when it comes to that. People keep going back for more. And one of the reasons is the rewards of success are so disproportionate.
Absolutely, but the cost for failure is also low in Silicon Valley, right? I mean, in part because there's so many other firms around. It's relatively easy to find someone else who's hiring. And that also makes a big difference. The problem with, you want to mitigate the cost of failure. You want to make it as low cost as possible. But you always have to worry about, are you making it so low cost that you're getting stupid failure, that you're getting people who just don't care because it's basically free for them to make mistakes. And so you always need to be, on the one hand, are we helping people move on? Are we giving them fresh starts? On the other hand, is it so easy that they're encouraged to take stupid risks? And I think Silicon Valley has that just about right. But in other areas, you can definitely see areas where we just encourage people to take stupid risks because why not?
I don't know if I'd give Silicon Valley that much credit because we have our boom and bust cycles. And when you're in an easy money cycle, there's an awful lot of stupid ideas that get funded.
Sure. But they do relatively little harm to the economy compared to, everyone investing in subprime mortgages.
It's not systemic.
Exactly.
Are there lessons that we can take from Silicon Valley and use in other areas?
Absolutely. So, I love the movies where they say failure is not an option. Understand that failure is always an option, and that it happened doesn't tell you that someone was an idiot, but it does tell you that there was a lesson to be learned there, that they got some piece of information. That piece of information may just be, we thought this product was good, but then costs rose because of, an input, the price of that rose,
changed,
or because there just wasn't a revenue model. Some of those things you can only find out by trying. And I think beyond that, it's diversifying, mitigating the downside, and not putting all of your eggs in one basket. And that's something that in general venture capitalists are pretty good at, right? They take big risks, but they take enough risks that no one risk is going to take down that VC firm. And that's also really important. You need to be prepared to take risks by making yourself as resilient to failure as possible after it happens.
Unless you're playing with other people's money. There have been some spectacular failures in clean tech. There's been a major initiative to put money into half-baked projects or science and technology that was not quite ready for prime time. You do tell a Solyndra story in your book. What did we learn from that?
Well, I think clean tech is a really difficult area because so much of it's dependent on the government, right? If you look at solar in particular, the price of solar has been falling really rapidly, which is exciting. I mean, I think we all would love to think that we could, instead of burning coal and natural gas, except for coal and natural gas companies, the rest of us would really love to think that we, instead of that,
wouldn't it be nice?
Have solar panels, right? But because we all wanted that so badly, a lot of governments were heavily subsidizing their installation. The Chinese government was heavily subsidizing production. And so, you've seen this collapse in prices, but it's really hard to tease out how much of it is natural improvements in technology and how much of it is either demand subsidies or supply subsidies. And the problem with that is, of course, as we hit the recession, what happened? They pulled the subsidies in Germany and Italy, which had been driving a lot of this.
And Spain. It collapsed over there first, and then the wave sort of came over here.
Right. And so what happens is, you're basically building a whole ecosystem around something, government funding, that can change really, really, really fast. And where you can't actually predict the ways in which it will change, right? Was anyone thinking, when there's a financial crisis, the government subsidies for solar will evaporate? All risks are obviously difficult to foresee, but government risks are kind of particularly difficult to foresee because the government, there's no predictability to it. A party changes, a coalition changes, and suddenly all of the rules get rewritten. And you're not dealing with a market or the natural world. You're dealing with this entity that's very, very difficult to predict.
Plus, they have the ability, just through the size and scope of what they do, to synchronize failures rather than let them happen independently of each other.
Exactly. That is a very good point, and that is a lot of what you saw with the program that Solyndra did. So, for example, a government-subsidized battery failure manufacturer failed, and that triggered problems at a government-subsidized electric car manufacturer, which was already having trouble anyway, but really sort of took them over. And similarly with Solyndra, we gave them a huge amount of money to build this factory, even though their previous factory wasn't at capacity.
Well, you call that the double down phenomenon. Talk about that.
They were losing money on every unit, and so they decided what they needed to do was make more units so that they could reduce the price. But of course, everyone else in the industry was doing the same thing, and since everyone else had lower costs to start with, it was doomed. Add to that the fact that you now have other governments in other countries changing your marketplace in ways that you can neither predict nor control, and it's just a toxic recipe for disaster.
We have those kinds of large synchronized disasters that produce headlines, and then we have the slow, insidious disasters that we learn to live with. I've seen estimates as high as 100,000 unnecessary deaths a year due to medical errors. One of the fields you look at quite closely in your book is healthcare, and in fact, you blend that with a personal story of your mom falling ill. And you look at how unable the industry seems to be from learning from its small failures. Tell us about that.
So hand washing is a major problem in the industry, and in general, more generally, keeping things sterile. And it's so big that there are estimates that 100,000 people a year die of hospital-acquired infections that are given to them that they didn't have when they went in. They get it from usually from other workers is how they're transmitted from the healthcare workers. And I'd written about this in abstract terms, and I wrote the same thing that everyone else writes, which is, oh, you have to tell them to wash your hands. And then I was there in the hospital, and I realized I'm not here all the time. And if I make them angry, then probably my mother's care is going to suffer. And suddenly it wasn't so simple. You also see when I had to administer IV antibiotics to her myself, how tempting it is when you mess something up and you have to go back and start this whole massive sterile procedure over. You can really see how if it wasn't someone's mother, they might be tempted to just kind of shortcut it. But
you'll be fine this time.
The problem is that doesn't kill someone every time. If it killed someone every time, they would do it every time. The problem is that it kills someone, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 times. And the other times, it doesn't. And so it's hard to see that you've made this mistake. And with medicine and education, we have this big problem of, because the inputs are so different, I mean, human beings are really non-standard, right? They're not like cars. That it's always hard to tell the difference between the treatment and the patient. You can treat two 65-year-olds for pneumonia exactly the same way, and one will die and one will get well. And just because they had different starting constitutions. And so what has happened in healthcare is that they make a huge number of these little mistakes that everyone agrees are wrong. You talk to any healthcare provider and they'll say, oh, washing your hands is imperative. You ask them, they will say they do it 100% of the time, but we know from watching them that they don't, and doing bacteria tests and similar. It's what I called spell check factor, right? And in this case, it's antibiotics. It's really, antibiotics will kill anything. So they made a ton of mistakes treating my mother, but it didn't matter because they had this super powerful antibiotic that took care of her appendix ruptured and spewed bacteria all over her abdominal cavity. But she had a super powerful antibiotic that took care of it eventually. And because they have this spell check factor, because they're actually protected quite a lot from their errors, it's very, very difficult to work that last bit of error out of the system that's killing a lot of people in aggregate because they can't see it. The feedback is just not there. And
it's hard to imagine how that's going to get fixed. Better data. I mean, what advice would you offer to the industry to improve?
So there have been the Netherlands, for example, does very, very well in hospital-acquired infection. The problem is that culturally it requires severe vigilance. So we've had success with checklists. We've also had success with empowering nurses to stop doctors, because doctors are, by the way, the worst offenders on this, to stop doctors from touching a patient if they see that they haven't washed their hands. But those sorts of things, it's like eternal vigilance. It's really, really being absolutely 100%. The organization has to be totally committed to the point of really angering their senior employees and mowing down anyone who gets an infection in these things. We're going to check out what you did and we're going to assume it was your fault. And that's a really difficult cultural shift to make, and most places just haven't managed it.
Talking about culture, one of the things you cover in Failure Modes is groupthink. And that's certainly something that affected the auto industry for a long time, right up to the disastrous bailout of General Motors. Give us the litany of what happened to that once proud American industry.
What's amazing is that people forget how great a company GM was in the 50s. They were the envy of the world. Science fiction writer Robert Heinlein wrote a book about going on a round-the-world trip for a year in 1954 and how the one thing that was like the biggest ambassador for the United States was the American car. Everyone wanted them. They couldn't get them. It was too expensive in local currency. But these were amazing machines. At one point, GM had more than half the cars on the road. It was manufactured by a single company, and they were great cars. And, you know, the line between that and now seems amazing to most people. But what you look at is that there's a series of things that happen. I mean, first of all, there's this oligopoly. 3 companies basically own the entire market. And then one union owns those 3 companies. And as prices go up, it's not a problem to start with. But then when foreign competition comes in, you got to do something to keep those workers happy. You can't negotiate the contracts down. And because there's such a big cost difference between them and Japan, they start taking the value out of the car to give to the unions in order to compete with the Japanese and then, you know, the Germans and so forth. So what happens when the foreign competition enters the market is that they've got these really expensive union contracts that they have to keep paying because they can't negotiate them down, because if they do, there will be a strike and they'll lose market share to both the new competitors and the other American companies. So instead what they do is they start taking the value out of the cars. So by 2000, 2005, there's basically a $3,000 cost difference between an American car and a foreign competitor that represents these union contracts.
And no one sounded the alarm inside these executive offices?
They did, but here's the thing. It's all happening so slowly. And remember that auto executives, it's a very insular culture. You have to move to Detroit. There's not much else in Detroit. It's very driven by the auto industry. And part of it is just an inability to imagine on either the union or the executive side that it could really come to this. So one of the most amazing things to me, by the summer of 2008, GM is burning $1 billion a month. Now they have about $30 billion in the bank. Of that $30 billion, they need $10 billion just to sort of keep the company, keep stuff turning over, right? So it's called working capital, which means they really have $20 billion that they can spend down. They're spending it at $1 billion a month, and that's rising. So by October, they're basically almost out of money. And Rick Wagoner, who's the CEO, absolutely refuses to contemplate securing what's called a debtor in possession financing line, which is what you use to finance a bankruptcy reorganization.
To do it right.
On the grounds that people would think the company is going bankrupt. Just like, Rick, people can read your financial statements. Everyone knows the company is going bankrupt. And on the other side, the union was genuinely surprised to find that they figured this out about 3 weeks before the company ran out of money. Even though arithmetic it's not like an advanced science, right? This is counting.
So what was it, shared
really
blindness that came over them all?
Absolutely. There's something called normalcy bias, which people suffer from. So you think that in an airplane crash or a fire in a theater that your biggest risk is getting trampled. In fact, the biggest risk is that you'll sit there too long and not get out fast enough, which surprises a lot. It certainly surprised me in the course of researching this. But the reason is that you can see why this is important. It keeps us calm in a crisis. You can see why our brains might have ended up this way. But when the crisis really hits, then we have a tendency to act as if everything is normal, even when it's not. And so you really need to be on guard against saying, well, you know, I'm not actually missing any limbs.
Yep.
I guess everything's fine. You know, if you're in a plane crash and it's on the ground, you get up, go to the exit, leave your luggage, and get out. But people don't.
They sit there. And even when they know it's coming, and we saw that in the banking industry. Everyone was dancing till the day it collapsed. You know, what happened then?
You know, I think you see this in Dick Fuld, the head of Lehman. He was holding out for what he called a Jamie deal. He wanted the same kind of deal that gotten for Bear Stearns, and that wasn't on offer. They got J.P. Morgan to do that. No one was willing to take on Lehman's liabilities at this point, except for some foreign firms that couldn't get regulatory approval. He could have done deals at disadvantageous prices, but he wanted to protect his shareholders. And by the way, he had like $1 billion worth of Lehman stock, so this was not just a disinterested thing. But he didn't seem to grasp, even though, again, you know, this was arithmetic. People could see what the hole was in the balance sheet based on what they were trading and where this was going pretty quick. But he just couldn't bring himself to say, it's over and what a lot of people have said to me is that the worst companies are really companies that have been very successful. And Lehman had been very successful. It had a proud history. GM had been maybe the most successful company in U.S. history in terms of size and wealth and profit. And the fact that they had been in that position made it impossible to recognize where they were now, partly because the loss, as you say, when we take big losses, we're tempted to double down, and partly because it just seems unimaginable, right? If you've been at Lehman your whole life, that the firm could just go away is very hard to
how could it disappear overnight? Can't possibly happen. And so
exactly.
It does happen. And in both cases, in the auto industry and in the banking industry, the taxpayers bailed them out, kept them going. And has this not contributed an awful moral hazard in both those industries when it comes to dealing with failure in the future?
I think it has, although in different ways. I mean, I'm not someone who thinks that you can explain the whole financial crisis by moral hazard. I actually think it's been more of a risk after the bailouts than before it. There was some before the bailouts, obviously, but I think it really started to appear after we bailed out first Bear Stearns and then after the Lehman collapse. We, then went in and did all AIG and so forth. That you see that these too big to fail banks borrow at cheaper rates.
Still do.
And our people are trying to get this status. And as a regulator said, if you're trying to get too big to fail status, we're doing it wrong. In the auto industry, I think the moral hazard has been somewhat on the union side, more because they got
rewarded handsomely in what should have been a bankruptcy that gave the money first to the secured creditors, but ended up giving it to the unions.
Yes. But I think that you can make an argument that by the late 2008, the credit markets were so messed up that GM couldn't have financed this bankruptcy without resorting to Uncle Sam. However, that's very different from what we did. We could have issued a standard DIP loan and taken the standard DIP profit off of it. Instead, we lost a ton of money by buying the company and arranging transfers to the UAW, retiree benefit funds, and stiffing senior creditors, especially in Chrysler. That wasn't necessary. And the bankruptcy court is very, very good at resolving industrial concerns. On the financial side, I think it's more complicated. We're not very good at that. The FDIC does a pretty good job, but it didn't cover these huge, complicated entities. And I think that what that points to is that we need much better resolution mechanisms. Unfortunately, Dodd-Frank, the big bill that was supposed to fix that, I think we spent a lot of energy on
doing other things,
randomly unrelated things, like what sort of fees credit card companies are allowed to charge retailers.
Well, Congressman didn't want to let a crisis go to waste, and so that everything but the kitchen sink is in there, and we still have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and we still have too big to fail.
Exactly.
Let me get back to your theme for a moment, because you talk about the U.S. being so different because failure is not fatal. We don't have debtor's prison. We do have a bankruptcy law that is extremely lenient. And yet, if people know this, if people know bankruptcy is easy, if companies know that they can be too big to fail, doesn't this make failure more likely?
Well, I think it goes back to culture a lot. And so what I argue in the case of bankruptcy is we've actually struck a pretty good bargain. Bankruptcy is very easy to get. I went to bankruptcy court in Memphis, and I was expecting tearful scenes and a lot of drama, and you can't even imagine how much nothing there is in bankruptcy court. There's a big crowd a couple times a week, but they're basically mostly calm, and when you go into the court itself, it's like traffic court. It's not even like traffic court. It's incredibly boring. And that's actually a good thing. Even then, though, even though it's pretty cheap to file and it's not that difficult, no one yells at you, most people don't who could benefit from bankruptcy. And I actually think that's a good balance. Why don't they? Because they're ashamed. There's a stigma to it. And so we have a strong culture that says only people who are really desperate should declare bankruptcy. So you're going to kind of get the fisheye if you do, which means that people who really need it do it and they move on. And people who don't, they struggle and they try to pay off their debts. And that gives us actually the great boons of easy bankruptcy for those who need it and cheap credit for those who need that. In the case of banking, I think you can make an argument that the culture of banking doesn't exist in that same realm, right? No. They're all very insular.
Nope.
They hang out with each other.
There's no shame in bailouts.
They all got bailouts. And so there isn't really much of a stigma on taking risks that could put the U.S. taxpayer
They were forced to take bailouts. I know bank board members who were forced to take money from the government in the TARP fiasco, even though they didn't need it because they didn't want to shame the other ones.
Exactly.
So if shame is still a part of keeping people out of bankruptcy, can we count on it? After all, shame used to be a big part of keeping people off welfare.
We can, but we can't just trust it to operate automatically. Culture needs to be tended. A strong cultural norm needs to be tended and it needs to be understood and enforced by the society it's in. If you stop doing that, as arguably, I mean, it's true, right? My grandparents were very poor during the Great Depression, but there was a great stigma on going on relief. And in their town, though, the people who they really couldn't feed their kids would go on relief. And it kept that kind of balance that I think we don't have now. I think it goes back to what you said about the bankers. They all took them because they didn't want part of them to feel ashamed, which is part of it is that you can't enforce a cultural norm if everyone is violating it. And, George Orwell said this about unemployment in the North, that it's impossible to tell people that they shouldn't go on the dole and they should get a job when everyone is out of work and they all know that how hard it is to get a job. Then you lose that stigma, and you can argue about whether that's good or bad, but you can't maintain it unless people feel like they're part of a larger society in which the undesirable behavior is a minority. We don't have a stigma on speeding. We could, but we've collectively decided that speeding isn't wrong unless you go very, very, very fast. But on the other hand, we didn't have a stigma against drunk driving, and we developed one. But you have to be proactive about it. You have to understand why it's important, and you have to get other people to buy in and enforce it by telling people who violate the law that they're wrong.
So, Megan, in the few moments we have left, from your own personal experiences and from observing others, what do you think are the sound principles for recovering from failure?
Well, the first is that, as I say, you have to recognize that failure is going to happen. It is a normal part of life. It is how everyone learns almost everything, from how to play tennis to how to walk to how to be in business. And so you have to understand that it's possible. You need to prepare for it by minimizing the downside, not taking suicidal risks. But then after it's happened, the first important thing is you have to recognize it. And that seems stupid, but as we've seen from GM and Solyndra and any number of companies and individual stories, tell some of mine in the book, it's actually really hard to recognize a failure, especially if it's a big crushing failure, because you're afraid and so you go into denial. And because you have these cognitive biases like normalcy bias that prime you to see things as normal even when they're not. And then after you've recognized that you failed, as quickly as possible, identified whether this is something that you know how to fix or whether you don't understand it or can't fix it and just need to move on, then you have to move on, to move forward. Don't get stuck there. Blaming and shaming has its place, but after you've understood what contributed to this, you've done your best, you have to say, okay, I learned something here. I'm not a failure. I'm someone who's failed, just like Ulysses S. Grant and Mark Twain and Churchill and every other great person I can name. And so now I'm going to take that and move forward and try something different.
As the song says, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and start all over again.
Exactly.
Megan, thanks so much for being on the show. It's been a delight.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to Megan McArdle, author of The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is the Key to Success, available in hard copy or ebook on Amazon.com. That wraps up our show for this week. This is Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Bill Frezza here, inviting you to drop me a line at bill@realclearradio.org if you'd like to suggest a topic or a guest. See you next week.